True. All right, and where is?
I just post the link. Yeah, I got it.
I'm doing in both Messenger and here.
Oh,
So.
it says the video is private.
It's probably in process because I said it public.
Ah.
Yeah, it's working for me.
Yep. Just post the link. Yeah, I got it.
I'm doing in both Messenger and here.
Oh, it says the video is private.
I can hear that.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. Change it so we can see it properly this way. All right, are you all ready? All right, hello everybody, hello YouTube. I guess I'll go ahead and get started here with finishing up chapter 1 on being's transition to determinate being, starting at going over the final remarks on the transition to becoming, and then going over to the transition to determinate being. When Hegel's going through remark 3, he kind of goes through the example. Yeah, so being and nothing, they're inseparable, but they're at the same time distinguished. So there's therefore now you can determine a third thing through them now, which is becoming. Transition, it's kind of also why he didn't use the term transition here, because while it kind of is the same thing, it leads to and it can lead to an idea of that you're going from one thing to another thing, and then that third thing is itself yet a separate thing. And so you end up kind of in an area where you're thinking about all these things in a deterministic mindset, but the problem is we haven't reached determinacy yet, so you can't presuppose such a thing. So one thing he does go into is a few examples of where in this way, a lot of people do also hold on to the idea of being and nothing as separate. Kind of the problems you can run into. So it goes all the way back to Parmenides, where he holds fast that being and nothing are in fact absolutely different. Being is, nothing is not. When you start at this point, then you kind of hit a beginning that immediately just ends because there's nowhere to go. So you end up having to bring something external in, but at this point in time, then you're no longer really, you're pretty much making yet a new beginning. But so since you're doing that, actually, let me move on there. And also with even brings in Fichte, which uses the example of kind of trying to solve a little bit of this, was that you start at being, which is just an identity. Then you have the antithesis, which as a start is itself kind of partially mediated and partially unmediated, which through a kind of negation of the first one itself then becomes fully mediated. But by going through this process, you can only, it's kind of brought in externally as a way to the first one. So in a way, the first one itself is then already itself determinate. But we haven't gotten there yet. So we're still starting at the indeterminate phase. So you've already kind of skipped forward. So that kind of already shows a contradiction in the process that shows that you're really not moving forward at that point. At the point though, the one he stayed a lot on, but I can understand why, because it is interesting, is Jacobi's attempt to himself start at the absolute immediate beginning. and trying to do the Kantian of kind of just going it there and just seeing it pretty much go nowhere where Kant says it goes. He's like, I'm trying to find the exact quote here. Yeah, for a time I must try clean to forget everything I saw, heard, touched, or handled anything at all, myself expressly not accepted. Clean, 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 must I forget all movement, all precisely just forgetting, because as hard as I must make my great concern. He must not let himself, must not be surrounded or pervaded by immutable space, or whatever pure abstract most abstract version of the concept he has. He must be in it, and so that way he for him seems to kind of get, not only just get stuck there, it kind of goes into this empty kind of version of it, or kind of a nothingness of it. And so he's like, well, what am I moving forward from? So although in this process, though, he is kind of in a way, because he is focusing on getting to this pure state, he gets to a pure nothing, and sort of like, because he gets this pure nothing, he's kind of in this concept where he directs kind of the conception of anything else. It seems that he is even rejecting the kind of any kind of synthesis of any kind, and is leading himself to kind of the most purest form of a synthesis, which is pretty much self-identity, where it just is, becomes is, etc., and moves on, not really allowing a form of, and it's not really, I think maybe because he isn't really looking for it, but a sense of an immediate synthesis. Because at that point, by rejecting, let's see here, blah, blah, blah. And also part of it, because he is also abstracting himself to something that is empiric. Yeah, sorry, kind of, I guess some of that got from me, but yeah, I didn't really get that point. But at that point, he does in fact show that when you go to like the most abstract, almost like even the most like purest concept, you do in fact get to nothing. So there is a synthesis that is happening right there, where pure nothing does come from whatever his form of pure being. So there is in a sense, a kind of transition happening here. Oh, another thing he does go through, though, is even if we get to the point of staying as pure nothing as a beginning, there's not really much different to change, because pure being, in fact, can, as we have shown earlier, can be derived itself comes from pure nothing. And so we're right back to where we actually started, because then pure being itself also shows to vanish into pure nothing. Make sure using, oh yeah, the other problem of using one can is itself a one-sided activity. You get yourself kind of stuck of abstracting only in a positive way, never really getting the negative. Using the example also of Parmenides, showing his example difference of non-being and being, by using the example of the one is, and then saying the one, which this point where the one is like, what was that part? He reaches a result that does, after removing from the one the various determinations of wholes and parts, etc., anything that doesn't belong to just the one, or would be like the most purest thing, gets himself down to the one is. So that's the example of something that is being, and then it claims he accomplishes transition into non-being by just saying the one. But the problem with this is again and the way he's using it is a deterministic or determined object already. So at that point, you're not getting to the most immanent pure thing, and therefore that proposition itself has a presupposition in it. And I guess talking about here about similarly doing the same thing of nothing in a sense, showing it in a deterministic way. But and this is the part I also think is going to be very important. It is going to be very important coming in here from the transition to becoming to determinate being. Talking for the example of like nothing just seems to be like the not of something else, in the sense that darkness is only the absence of light. So light is the real thing here. Cold is just a nothing of non-heat. So heat's the thing there, but of course that's not really what that is, because if you really look into it, this feels like a more monistic view when you look at it, because to a certain extent there is still a cold within heat, or a dark, because you can't really in a darkness within light, because it is kind of a degree of darkness allows you to see light, because otherwise we're kind of back to the example of pure nothing and pure darkness and pure light. You really can't see anything because it's just is one or the other. So in that way, there does seem to be this kind of continuation, like I said, a monistic continuity, where there is a sort of sense of a mix between not light and light. So of course is the intensity, or degrees of heat. I believe he's coming in here though, so in that sense, the negation itself is actually intimately involved with the thing that you're talking about. It is not a separate thing, so therefore it is not sort of thrown away. And his remark 4 here is an attempt from Kant to kind of show the incomprehensibility at the beginning, which itself starts out by assuming yet again the separateness of being and nothing, which Hegel himself has already shown is in fact is directly irrecoverably interrelated. So it's like it is impossible for anything to begin insofar it is not, insofar as something is, or it has being, is not just beginning. And so basically this idea is kind of perpetual. If it exists, it exists. If it's not, it's not. So where does a beginning come from? But in this way, again, as we've gone back, becoming itself shows as existing as nothing itself vanishing into being, and being itself vanishing into a nothing. Which now he does show there are the moments of becoming, which as I've said, for an example of being itself vanishing into its other of nothing, we see that self is a ceasing to be as a thing, and the same in the opposite of nothing itself vanishing into being itself is a coming to be. Each of itself does show up as as a concept of a becoming. But so in this way, this is in a sense a double determination of being. So they're both in a way the same thing, but also in the opposite, of course, because one is transitioning into the other. So this way they're still distinguished, but they are themselves also again both moments of this becoming. But they are also not like a kind of double sublation, because they themselves are only just a sublation that goes into one way, which itself sublates into the other. There's no like sublation on top of itself. But now we see through this process that because being itself is vanishing into nothing and nothing itself is vanishing into being, we now start to see that maybe that itself, they are not really, because go back to the remember, because that we had pure being, but itself then doesn't, pure being itself never really seemed to be itself, because it's indeterminate, basically seemed to be a sheer nothing. So at that point, it no longer seemed to be a pure being. So, sorry, let me get my thoughts back on this. So sheer nothing itself, then itself in its kind of seems to be itself in its purity and its immediacy, itself vanishes into pure being. But in this of itself, then it seems that these two things, even though they are distinct, are themselves also even more show themselves to be kind of the, in their distinguishedness seems to show that they are not themselves just entirely separate. They seem to be also directly interrelated. So in this sense, there seem, and through the transitions we saw before, it doesn't seem that they're really pure nothing is vanishing to pure being. There seems to be an actual kind of transition happening here. So in that way, the vanishing itself of between these objects are kind of gone. And now we see that there's a sort of transition in between. So in that sense, there's also seems to be times where that vanishing itself seems to cease. And now we get into a state of kind of a, it feels like kind of itself, the transition between being and non-being seems to be more smooth instead of just vanishing into each other. And now at this point, we're kind of in a sense of the determinate being. Let me think about that a little better. Because they themselves have set it into a uni of a oneness. So it seems, and I like to think back to an example of something a little more concrete, is kind of in the sense of an existence of a human being. So you have, and this is obviously temporally in time instead of this. So there is a state of not being for a person, and then that person is born and they are, they exist, they are being, and then in death they become itself non-being. So through this is, I think, the best example in my mind, showing the example of how they are in their unity, but at the same time we have a new sense of distinguishedness. And now we kind of derive out a concept. There is something to be able to determine here. And just to say briefly, he talks about why he uses the example of the word sublate instead of, say, preservation. Because it contains kind of both a positive and negative element at the same time. So there's a preservation, but itself is preserved in a negation of its original self. It's in ways kind of now through a mediated process, like I'd say pickling a cucumber. It's preserved, but it is also no longer what it originally was at the same time. It's in a mediated state in the new thing, a pickle. All right. So at this point, do we have any questions? I see Matt's already on stack.
Yeah, hi. Okay. I have a lot of questions, but every time I read and reread this first chapter, new stuff comes up for me.
Right.
So in the section where we're covering I just wanted to give a quick, just to give a bird's eye view to the audience. Hegel covers the isolating of the abstractions, being and nothing, by previous philosophies as well as contemporaries of his that try to hold being and nothing separately when actually they are the same thing, while also being not the same thing. He then goes on to talk about the incomprehensibility of the beginning, as conceived by some philosophers. I can't remember which ones he cites or if he even names them, but basically, they try to talk about being in nothing such that it would be unthinkable to think of a beginning at all, as if it always was, or if it never was. And of course, never was doesn't make any sense, but it does make sense. And some earlier philosophies said that it's always been this way, right? There has never been a beginning. He talks about the moments of becoming, which are the coming to be and ceasing to be. And there's sort of inflection, see, as becoming is the truth of the vanishing of being and nothing. Of course, the moments of becoming are, there are two of them, and each of them has their own character in their transition one way or the other. Okay, and let's see, in becoming, right, become in the process of becoming, and we're not talking about something determinate here, just becoming as a state, right? And Hegel says this is a very barbarous term, very what do I want to say? Inexact, much like his earlier use of unity. And so he gives us that. You can't collapse back into the indeterminate nothing because we've already determined it as a moment of becoming. So we can't move backwards, we can only move forwards. He says that the character of being and nothing have an uneven character value in the becoming because it's going in one direction. It can't go back the way it came. He talks about the sublation of becoming. In the final pages, and just sort of outlines sort of what it looks like, as well as the stable result that it settles into once it has finished becoming. In other words, it's double vanishing. It's the double vanishing of the being vanishing, the nothing vanishing as moments, and the vanishing itself vanishing. And then he goes on to talk about the meaning of sublation and how it's fortunate in the German language, and he's talking in the German language, that one word can mean both. It will have opposite meanings, basically disappearance as well as preservation, and how that's quite fortunate, whereas say Latin unfortunately sticks to it. Its opposites a lot more firmly. I'm going to stop there and let Jim talk. Go ahead, Jim.
So brief response, which was this was Hegel's writing probably at its worst, and as even Kyle tries to summarize it, still comes across as very, very convoluted. And I think of it, what Hegel needed to do was diagram this out. I mean, we saw some of us even when we were in the smaller, larger part. There, Hegel was forced to, since he was writing for an audience of undergraduates, he had to make some concessions to make his ideas understandable. Whereas right here, he doesn't seem to be making the effort to do that. If I or someone else had the time, we probably would have tried diagram this whole thing, because I think it's very easy to get lost in the details and miss the broader points.
Go ahead, Doug.
Hopefully, so the stuff on sublation or Aufhebung was particularly interesting to me, since, as he says, has a twofold meaning in the language. On the one hand, it means to preserve, to maintain, and equally, it also means to cause, to cease, to put an end to. So it's this very, elusive term that means a bunch of things. And it's been controversial in the very broad Marxist left tradition. I mean, it's for Lenin, Trotsky, upheld this concept. The Soviet Union under Stalin and onward upheld it. And there's actually a part of the Sino-Soviet split actually involved a rejection of this at the philosophical level. If you read Mao's talks on philosophy, he says that the negation of the negation, which is basically what the sublation is, it's not real. It doesn't exist. And the only thing that matters is the unity of opposites. And the way I've understood this is the Maoists think that the negation of the negation basically is this teleological, fatalistic mode of thinking. And they're trying to, in their view, which I don't agree with, they think they're more open by just viewing the unity of opposites. I think certainly the Soviet Union, after, say, like the 1920s, had a very crappy view officially on how they viewed philosophy as this very teleological, fatalistic. But I think when you actually look at sublation, it's not this kind of, rigid in this, fatalistic view. It's like, and it's not just a return, it's a return at a higher level. So like when we imagine socialism and communism, it's both going beyond it. Obviously, we're abolishing private ownership of the means of production, but it's also taking, preserving like that productive capacity of capitalism. And in a certain sense, it's even like bringing to a higher level the old kind of communal forms of social organization that had existed, in prehistorical eras as well. And I just, so it's just kind of interesting how this, the whole term, negation of negation, sublation, which kind of have played themselves out within the, the whole broad Marxist left tradition, which, we could talk about a lot, but I'll stop there for now.
Go ahead, JR.
Yeah, thanks, comrades. And some good contributions here. I kind of like just hearing this, it kind of and reading through the text, it like reminds me of like movement in a sense, right? That like in transition, right? Like as I was taught it, when you're moving, when you're just simply like walking, you have one left foot, behind you, and then one right foot in front of you, and you have the starting point and this end point, right? You have A and B, and in that sense, A and B are kind of equal, so that similar to like this sense of like nothingness towards is similar to kind of being. And in that transition is that kind of like state, whereas like it's kind of confusing, but that's like where my mind goes when I hear about this and I read this. I think about kind of like that movement scenario of dialectics to an extent, and Marx wrote a little bit about that. So that's kind of what comes into mind when I hear about that. That's kind of like how I am understanding it. Is it similar to that? Is it kind of like on the right path? That's I guess a general question on that basis.
Okay, I put myself on stack, and I just want to address a couple things, and I may or may not be very comprehensible, more any more comprehensible than Hegel himself, but I'll give it a shot. One of the things that I think accounts for what Jim called the bad writing is that personally I don't see it as bad writing. I just see it as you're talking about three states of being that are extremely abstract and at this stage quite undetermined by design. Okay, and he spends the time in the comments in his remarks on the unity of being and nothing, basically trying to tell you that if you conceive of being or nothing in a determinate way, comparing it to a concrete state of being, or something in the real world, you're basically pulling the argument out of the logic that we're reading in the chapter 1 and fast forwarding it into either the doctrine of the concept, which is book 3 of this book, or you're going all the way into nature or even into psychology, which is I'm not going to say that it's wrong, but it short circuits what you can say about being and nothing and becoming and the characteristics and what it's doing. And really, at the end of the day, all he can do to talk about these things is to talk about how previous philosophers, Kant, Fichte, Jacobi, Parmenides, dealt with these very, very diluted abstractions and demonstrate why them being held apart from each other, in other words, not being the same as we've already deduced, runs into problems, as well as the problem with the beginning, because it's not like there's a perfect beginning he could have began at. He could have chosen one or the other, and he probably would have ended up in the same place. But he chose for the primacy of the argument being, because being is still an existent state, and you can't even say existent at this category level because that's the doctrine of essence talking. So yeah, there's actually not much content at this stage to talk about in terms of being and nothing, other than to try to reiterate in every way, shape, or form how these states of being function at that abstract level. And he goes to some pains at every step of the way to say that well, let me see if I can find a good example. I'm looking at the incomprehensibility of being. And so, with the absolute separateness of being from nothing presuppose, then of course, beginning or becoming is something incomprehensible. For a presupposition is made which annuls the beginning or the becoming, which yet is again admitted. So they admit in their argument that it's happened, but it's incomprehensible that it's happened. So it's almost unsayable, but at the same time it happened, right? In their argument, right? And this contradiction thus posed at the same time made impossible of solution is called incomprehensible. The foregoing dialectic is the same too as that which understanding employs the notion of infinitesimal magnitudes given by higher analysis. In other words, sort of, you know, the mathematical analysis that says that an infinitesimally small number is and is not is ludicrous to Hegel, because as he demonstrated, there are the states of being and nothing, right? And if they are not in each other in a single unity and are the same, right? Then which are they, right? You know, you try to make that argument from a mathematical point of view, as happened in his day. You know, the argument just sort of falls apart, and they say, well, the numbers say it's good. Okay, quantity is great, but what about the quality? What about the quality of this thing you're talking about? All over the map, full of contradictions that cannot be resolved, except in the dialectic of being and nothing and their actual truth, right? So you know, so there's that. And I love this on 105. He talks about here too, the absolute separation of being and nothing is assumed, but against this, it has been shown that being and nothing are in fact the same, or to use the same language as that just quoted, that there is nothing which is not in intermediate state between being and nothing. It is to the adoption of the said determination which understanding opposes that mathematics owes its most brilliant successes. This style of reasoning, which makes and clings to the false presupposition of the absolute separatedness of being and nothing and non-being, is to be named not dialectic, but sophistry. For sophistry is an argument proceeding from a baseless presupposition which is uncritically and unthinkingly adopted. But we call dialectic the higher movement of reason, in which such seemingly utterly separate terms pass over into each other spontaneously through that which they are, a movement in which the presupposition sublates itself. It is the dialectical immanent nature of being and nothing themselves to manifest their unity, that is, becoming as their truth. And there's just poetry almost at that level. There are some passages in here in which and I noticed this too, he talks about the relation of being and nothing, and really the relation, almost the opposition of being and nothing. Using that word, one could argue that he's straying a little bit language-wise into the doctrine of essence, where there are opposites. But here, you know, he makes very clear that they have passed over into each other and therefore are the same. So it's not like one depends on the other. It's more like one collapses into the other and vice versa. And the fact is that they're not, being that indeterminate, they're not sufficient for a ground, right? He says that they're a fiction, right? It's the beginning. He says, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I think this point is important. The what does he call it? He calls it a figment of the imagination, a sort of yeah, he's on page 88. He says, determinate being is the first category to contain the real difference of being and nothing, namely something another. And this is an assurance at this point. He has not proven it yet. It is this real difference which is vaguely present in ordinary thinking, instead of abstract being and pure nothing, and their only imagined difference. So if you imagine a difference, a real difference between being and nothing and hold them apart, you're basically thinking in determinate terms, and you cannot apply it to the indeterminacy of sheer being and sheer nothing. I'll leave it there. And Kyle, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, and of course you brought up kind of, I think a quote back that was more what I was trying to get at is there is nothing which is an indeterminate state between being and nothing. And I feel like that's the kind of thing that we learn in becoming that leads us to be able to determine determinate being. In a sense, that it is you're able to determine that there's a determinacy between non-being and being. Of course, it's also interesting kind of thinking about us kind of through the phenomenology of spirit, kind of already in a way going through this process, be able to use pre-existing terms at the very basic start. But I think the one thing that really got me this go around was getting past the point of thinking of being vanishing into nothing, vanishing into being in an infinite loop, and it realized it's really not that. It's in a way, it's kind of actually kind of going back to capital. It's like the commodity exchange, where from like one person's perspective, commodity itself is becoming money, and from the other perspective, money is becoming the commodity.
A sale is a purchase, and a purchase is a sale.
Right. So there's a transit. So it's this kind of thing, like it requires something to cease for something else to become, to come into being. So that I think is something that made that transition to understanding the transition to determinate being much easier this time around.
Agreed.
Yeah, I guess you're right. That they are different. They are the same thing, but from different perspectives, right? So
Yeah, the truth of the two moments in their unseparated unity as becoming, right? People try and he detail. I forget where the quote is in here. I should be highlighting the crap out of this because I keep half remembering things and wanting to get there. But he talks about how previous philosophies tried to define what the truth of being and the truth of nothing were, and it's usually a third thing. Like they mention that it's a third thing, and he relates what that third thing is for them, right? And it ends up at dead ends, whereas the third thing ends up being what makes being and nothing in their indeterminateness subsist, which is, in other words, what preserves indeterminate being and nothing. They're preserved within becoming, and even becoming as an unstable state of being settles into determinacy that contains all three. And the sort of ability of a determinate being as an abstract category will contain those moments of being, of not being, as well as becoming, coming to be, and ceasing to be. And again, the reality that he's narrating at this level, but making a logical argument about, we can't presume that we're going to end up at a certain place, but at the same time, in describing concrete reality, which already exists, and he knows this, we're talking about properties of reality at the most abstract level, in order to map out what they contain, what it will have turned out to have contained, if I can say that. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm still processing it in my head, but he knows reality exists. How do we logically and internally create a logic that will include everything that we know about it without presuming it exists from the start. It's a very difficult question to ask because it's easiest just to start with the concrete and say, this is an apple tree. It exists. Okay, great, wonderful. So you're in the philosophy of nature somewhere, right? But how do you go from there to being able to map out and track the states of abstract being as it's conceived in thought, right? You just all over the place, right? But doing it this way allows you, I think, to climb back up from abstract to concrete on a ladder or a set of stairs that already exists, but you've got to feel your way up, I guess you could say. Stacks open. Yeah, the first several times I read this chapter, and I have read it 2 or 3 or 4 times. The first time, the only images that came into my head of these states were all determinate. I can tell you that. And I could not say that until this reading, right? That's what they were, okay? And it's easiest for us to compare them to concrete determinate states because that's all we know, right? We live in the determinate finite sphere. There's no, this is not flat land, and we cannot, except in thought, and it's by thought. That's the tool we have to abstract. In thought, we can construct these things, and that's kind of Hegel's point too. But when talking about it, he talks about how previous philosophers make the mistake of thinking of being a nothing as determinate, but he really can't do much more than map it out logically for us, which is why the writing shifts between the logical arguments on pages 82 and 83, right? And then the rest of the chapter up to, I want to say, up to 105, really, because then he finishes out his argument for becoming and what it actually consists of. And it doesn't consist of very much, just being a nothing, being what they are as moments that collapse into each other. And just for a bird's eye view, and he's already said this earlier in the book, in this, what is it, this doctrine of being, the states of being are kind of like that. In a progressing sort of way, they collapse, yeah, not all of them do that. There's something else about that. I know essence relates related opposites that are in each other. They have the other, right? Plus has minus, right? Positive has negative, and can't do without the other within the doctrine of essence. And then when that's sublated, the objective categories basically contain the full movement all the way up to absolute idea. But here, concept is development, but here the concepts sort of Yeah, I'm gonna have to come back to that. Sorry. Stack is open. It's 9:57. Does anyone have any other thoughts or connections outside of the text, or anything you've been sort of thinking about as you've read this? Anything at all?
I guess I'll go back to the comment I made earlier based off response to you. It's this Carl Sagan quote: "Before you can make an apple pie, you have to create the universe."
Create the universe. Yes, I love that song. Oh,
So that's kind of what we're doing here. Is before you can even think about these, you have to start at the beginning.
I have played that song over and over. For the audience who doesn't know, go look up Carl Sagan and what's the title, Kyle? It's A Glorious Dawn. Go look up A Glorious Dawn on YouTube. It's beautiful. It's a montage of Carl Sagan singing, but he's not really singing. They're just sort of splicing his words together with like an auto tune, and it's actually pretty good. Yeah. Kyle put it in the chat. It's great. But yeah, I agree. One must create the universe. I'd like to look this up, but I wonder how much Carl Sagan looked into the dialectical structure of reality, or if he was all in tune with any of that. He lived during the Cold War, so I would imagine that a lot of it probably sounded like mumbo jumbo to him, but maybe not. I don't know. Okay, all right. If no one has anything for the broadcast, I'll just let you guys
Well,
know.
Carl Sagan's friend Stephen
yeah,
Gould was into dialectics to some extent.
What's that?
Carl Sagan's friend Stephen Jay Gould was into dialectics to some extent.
They probably talked about it then at some point. Would have been interesting to listen in.
And Gould was basically a red diaper baby.
All right.
All right.
Anything else?
Yeah, chapter 2. I'm not sure how far we should read, to be honest with you, because I don't want to get too far, just in case we just sort of get bogged down. Because chapter 1 was easy to cover in a couple, but after this, things get a little bit more complicated, as we remember from the smaller logic.
We just do A, determinate being as such, and stop before at finitude. That's
Yeah. Page 109. Well, the A.V. Miller, chapter 2 up to B, finitude, which is 116 on the A.V. Miller. So chapter 2, and we'll do A and stop on 116. And I mean, if we run out of time, we can always just keep talking a little bit more. I mean, we've read through we've read through the smaller logic, but at the same time, I'm finding there's a lot more here than just the smaller logic. So I'm glad we're getting into this. So yeah, thank for all watching the broadcast. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.